2 a.m. Welcome back to the 2 a.m. Book Review Club, where we stay up late talking about books or talk about books that made us stay up late. Today, we are celebrating the release of the brand new Hunger Games movie, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, by looking back at the books that kickstarted it all, the iconic Hunger Games trilogy. And yes, I will also be touching on The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, the book, at the end of the video. But first, let's rewind all the way back to 2008. You Belong With Me is on the radio, Hannah Montana is on Disney Channel, Twilight is in theaters, and The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins has just hit bookshelves and scholastic book fairs everywhere. The Hunger Games was a huge deal when it first came out, and I do mean huge. Here's a quote from Wikipedia. After writing the novel, Collins signed a six-figure deal for 3 books with Scholastic. First published as a hardcover in the United States on September 14th, 2008, The Hunger Games had a first printing of 50,000 copies, which was bumped up twice to 200,000 copies. By February 2010, the book had sold 800,000 copies, and rights to the novel had been sold in 38 territories worldwide. A few months later, in July, the book was released in paperback. The Hunger Games entered the New York Times bestseller list in November 2008, where it would feature for over 100 consecutive weeks. By the time the film adaptation of The Hunger Games was released in March 2012, the book had been on USA Today's bestsellers list for 135 consecutive weeks and has sold over 17.5 million copies. Like I said, The Hunger Games, Book 1 was a huge deal. Even today, it continues to have enormous cultural relevance, and not just because a prequel came out in 2021. Looking back at this book and its lasting legacy, I do think it's fair to ask why. Why, out of all the YA bestsellers that came out of the 2000s and 2010s, is The Hunger Games a trilogy that we remember so well? And why do we remember it with such respect? I mean, look at what happened to Twilight. It was also a massively successful, roughly contemporaneous trilogy of books turned movies that has since become mostly a target of ridicule. To be remembered, not just fondly, but with respect, after more than a decade is quite an accomplishment, and I think it's worthwhile to examine why. And I have come up with 5 reasons that The Hunger Games is an enduring success, starting with reason number 1, its premise. The first thing that we all remember when it comes to The Hunger Games is its premise. The country of Panem has 12 districts, and every year, 1 boy and 1 girl are sent from each district to fight to the death in the titular Hunger Games, which take place in the country's capital. Only 1 child, 1 tribute, can survive. And these annual games are a punishment enforced by the capital in retribution for the failed revolution instigated by the districts against the capital many decades ago. It's an audacious premise for a book targeted mainly towards YA and middle grade readers, but it's also brilliant because it works on both an emotional and an abstract level. On an emotional level, you immediately understand the stakes. Is Katniss Everdeen going to survive the Hunger Games? But the premise also really makes you think. How did this situation happen in the first place? How is everyone okay with this? What are these Hunger Games like? How do they work? What is it like for these kids to be subjected to this ordeal? A simple, easy to understand premise that can get both your brain and your heart involved is very clearly going to be a formula for success. Reason number 2 is, of course, the character of Katniss. Our protagonist is Katniss Everdeen, a 16-year-old girl from District 12, the coal mining district. And if you know anything at all about the history of coal mining, then you know that that's a pretty bleak existence. Katniss's father was a coal miner, but he was killed years ago in a coal mining incident, and now Katniss is pretty much responsible for supporting her mother, with whom she has a complicated relationship, and also her younger sister Primrose, who Katniss is incredibly protective of. So when Prim's name is drawn to compete in the Hunger Games, Katniss is like, that's not happening, and she steps in instead because that's how much she loves Prim. As Katniss herself says, District 12 hasn't had a volunteer in decades, and the protocol has become rusty. The rule is that once a tribute's name has been pulled from the ball, another eligible boy, if a boy's name has been read, or girl, if a girl's name has been read, can step forward to take his or her place. In some districts, in which winning the reaping is such a great honor, people are eager to risk their lives. The volunteering is complicated, but in District 12, where the word tribute is pretty much synonymous with the word corpse, volunteers are all but extinct. Katniss is compassionate, but she's also tough. She cares about many people throughout the story, Prim, Rue, Peeta, but at the end of the day, she also does what needs to be done, even if that means killing others. Katniss is also a character type often found in middle grade and YA books, which is the role model character. When you're reading The Hunger Games, you aspire to become Katniss. If you have to live in District 12, you want to be self-sufficient and clever, like Katniss, who hunts in the woods with her best friend Gale and sells her game in order to support her family. She does what she needs to do in order to survive, and I think that's best illustrated by this excerpt where she's reminiscing about meeting Gale for the first time. "Hey, Catnip," Gale says. "My real name is Katniss, but when I first told him, I had barely whispered it, so he thought I'd said catnip. Then, when this crazy lynx started following me around the woods looking for handouts, it became his official nickname for me. I finally had to kill the lynx because he scared off game. I almost regretted it because he wasn't bad company, but I got a decent price for his pelt." Katniss is loyal and prioritizes the people she cares about, but she's not particularly sentimental when it comes to doing what she has to do. But also, if you have to go to the Hunger Games, would you rather be picked and forced to go, or would you rather heroically volunteer? You would heroically volunteer, because then you get this scene. "To the everlasting credit of the people of District 12, not one person claps. Not even the ones holding betting slips, the ones who are usually beyond caring. Possibly because they know me from the Hob, or knew my father, or have encountered Prim, who no one can help loving. So instead of acknowledging applause, I stand there unmoving, while they take part in the boldest form of dissent they can manage, silence, which says we do not agree, we do not condone. All of this is wrong. Then something unexpected happens. At least, I don't expect it, because I don't think of District 12 as a place that cares about me. But a shift has occurred since I stepped up to take Prim's place, and now it seems I have become someone precious. At first one, then another, then almost every member of the crowd touches the 3 middle fingers of their left hand to their lips and holds it out to me. It is an old and rarely used gesture of our district, occasionally seen at funerals. It means thanks. It means admiration. It means goodbye to someone you love. I mean, who would not want this to be their send-off to the Hunger Games, assuming they had to go? If you have to be someone in Panem, you want to be Katniss. You want to be the plucky underdog, the person that people admire, the person that people root for. I do want to make an important distinction here that while Katniss is a role model character, she is not a self-insert character. That term is usually used to describe a character who has no real reason for achieving their goals and gaining the other character's respect. Other than that is what the story calls for. Katniss does both of these things, but she does so via pre-established personality traits and skills. She's not an archer out of nowhere. She's not tough and determined out of nowhere. Those things are inherent to who she is. Reason number 3 is the writing. Writing is always a key component to a book's success. No kidding. And for the Hunger Games specifically, the premise is hard to pull off in a way that is both engaging but not too difficult or dark for younger readers. There are 2 key components to Suzanne Collins' writing. One, it's surprisingly lighthearted in places, which brings an important dimension to Katniss's character. When she's on her way to the games, when she's in the Capitol, waiting for the games to begin, Katniss isn't always laser focused on, the possibility of her imminent death. She does think about it, but she's often focused on the small things that are happening in that moment. For example, on the train that is taking them to the Capitol, Katniss gets to try hot chocolate for the first time. "They call it hot chocolate," says Peeta. "It's good." I take a sip of the hot, sweet, creamy liquid, and a shudder runs through me, even though the rest of the meal beckons. I ignore it until I've drained my cup. This is a small moment that I chose partially because I also love hot chocolate, but it really shows you how Katniss always tries to exist in the moment. And these light-hearted moments also bring an important balance to the tone of the book. The other key component of the writing is that Suzanne Collins really knows how to write a dramatic scene, how to give the proper weight to important moments. The most intense dramatic moment in this book has to be the scene where Katniss finds Rue's body. For context, Rue is a kid that Katniss partners up with during the games, in no small part due to the fact that Rue is small and vulnerable and really reminds Katniss of Prim. After teaming up, Katniss enlists Rue's help in a plot to blow up the Careers hoard of supplies. Careers are kids from wealthy districts who are trained their entire lives to participate in the Hunger Games, and they are Katniss's #1 obstacle in winning. At this point in the book, they have amassed a huge hoard of supplies, and Katniss knows that if she can destroy those supplies, then she will really have an upper hand, an advantage. The plan does go well, it is successful, she blows up their supplies, But in the time that Katniss and Rue spend apart, Rue is killed by one of the couriers. Here's what happens when Katniss finds her body. I can't stop looking at Rue, smaller than ever. A baby animal curled up in a nest of netting. I can't bring myself to leave her like this, past harm, but seeming utterly defenseless. To hate the boy from District 1, who also appears so vulnerable in death, seems inadequate. It's the Capitol I hate for doing this to all of us. Gale's voice is in my head. His ravings against the Capitol no longer pointless, no longer to be ignored. Rue's death has forced me to confront my own fury against the cruelty, the injustice they inflict upon us. But here, even more strongly than at home, I feel my impotence. There's no way to take revenge on the Capitol. Is there? Then I remember Peeta's words on the roof. Only I keep wishing I could think of a way to show the Capitol they don't own me, that I'm more than just a piece in their games. And for the first time, I understand what he means. I want to do something right here, right now, to shame them, to make them accountable, to show the Capitol that whatever they do or force us to do, there is a part of every tribute they can't own, that Rue was more than a piece in their games. And so am I. A few steps into the woods grows a bank of wildflowers. Perhaps they are really weeds of some sort, but they have blossoms in beautiful shades of violet and yellow and white. I gather up an armful and come back to Rue's side. Slowly, one stem at a time, I decorate her body in the flowers, covering the ugly wound, wreathing her face, wreathing her hair with bright colors. They'll have to show it, or even if they choose to turn the cameras elsewhere at this moment, they'll have to bring them back when they collect the bodies, and everyone will see her then and know I did it. I step back and take a last look at Rue. She could really be asleep in that meadow after all. Bye, Rue, I whisper. I press the 3 middle fingers of my left hand against my lips and hold them out in her direction. Then I walk away without looking back. It's such a tragic moment, but it's also a turning point for Katniss as a character, from someone who is focused on survival to someone who is also becoming a symbol of defiance against the Capitol. Reason number 4 is the pacing. My paperback edition is 374 pages, and if you look at the overall plot structure, these 374 pages are utilized really well. It takes 11 chapters and 148 pages to actually get to the Hunger Games, because the Hunger Games is not just about throwing kids in an arena and watching them fight to the death. It's also about the pageantry, the spectacle of the whole thing. TV interviews, luxurious surroundings, chariot parades, the centering of the audience experience, the audience's entertainment. And then, once the games actually begin, things start happening pretty quickly. There's a lot of fast-paced excitement. Katniss gets her supplies, she runs through the woods, she finds a tree, the couriers find her because Peeta has teamed up with them, which of course is a huge betrayal. Then Rue enters the picture, and there's a bit of a lull in the action as they team up and bond. But of course, then Katniss comes up with the plan to torch the courier's supplies, and she does, but just as we're riding that emotional high, Rue dies. And that's how this book is structured. The tension builds up and builds up. then it relaxes and we get more emotion-based, character-driven scenes. Then there's more action, then we take another break. It gives us time to get to know Katniss, to get to know the other characters, to get to know the world. This isn't just a high-octane action-adventure story, it's also a very human experience. Reason number 5 is the inclusion of elements that appeal specifically to middle grade and YA readers. And these elements are 1, the glitz and the glamour, and 2, the romance. As I mentioned earlier, there's a significant chunk of page space between Katniss volunteering for the Hunger Games and the games actually beginning. And a good deal of that page space is devoted to Katniss's physical appearance. Katniss gets multiple makeovers once she reaches the capital. Katniss gets cool costumes. Katniss gets lots of attention from said cool costumes. Now, these Cinderella-esque dress-up / makeover sequences are meant to illustrate the vast gulf of social inequity between the capital and District 12, between dressing up for fun and scrabbling to survive. But it's also fun to read about Katniss going from this kid in the coal district whose existence revolves around supporting her family to this girl whose costumes are grabbing everyone's attention. Here's the iconic scene featuring Katniss and Peeta making their grand entrance in the tribute chariot parade, wearing their costumes that make them look like they're on fire. The crowd's initial alarm at our appearance quickly changes to cheers and shouts of District 12. Every head is turned our way, pulling the focus from the 3 chariots ahead of us. At first, I'm frozen, but then I catch sight of us on a large television screen, and am floored by how breathtaking we look. In the deepening twilight, the fire illuminates our faces. We seem to be leaving a trail of fire off the flowing capes. Cinna was right about the minimal makeup. We both look more attractive, but utterly recognizable. Remember, heads high, smiles. They're going to love you. I hear Cinna's voice in my head. I lift my chin a bit higher, put on my most winning smile, and wave with my free hand. I'm glad now I have Peeta to clutch for balance. He is so steady, solid as a rock. As I gain confidence, I actually blow a few kisses to the crowd. The people of the capital are going nuts, showering us with flowers, shouting our names, our first names, which they have bothered to find on the program. The pounding music, the cheers, the admiration work their way into my blood, and I can't suppress my excitement. Cinna has given me a great advantage. No one will forget me. Not my look, not my name. Katniss, the girl who is on fire. Or how about this scene where Cinna is dressing Katniss for her TV interview? Then Cinna enters with what I assume is my dress, but I can't really see it because it's covered. Close your eyes, he orders. I can feel the silken inside as they slip it down over my naked body. Then the weight. It must be 40 pounds. I clutch Octavia's hand as I blindly step into my shoes, glad to find they are at least 2 inches lower than the pair Effie had me practice in. There's some adjusting and fidgeting, then silence. Can I open my eyes? I ask. Yes, Cinna says. Open them. The creature standing before me in the full-length mirror has come from another world, where skin shimmers and eyes flash, and apparently they make their clothes from jewels. Because my dress, oh my dress, is entirely covered in reflective precious gems, red and yellow and white, with bits of blue that accent the tips of the flame design. The slightest movement gives the impression I am engulfed in tongues of fire. I am not pretty. I am not beautiful. I am radiant as the sun. I mean, who hasn't fantasized about feeling this way, about being perceived this way, about being admired, adored, seen? Middle grade and YA readers in particular are at that age where they crave this kind of external validation, and they eat up books that fulfill that desire. Readers in this age range also love romance, and somewhat surprisingly, The Hunger Games has a lot of it. There's Gale, Katniss' best friend, who she cares deeply about. He hunts with her in the woods of District 12, he hates the Capitol, and he fantasizes about running away with Katniss to a place where they don't have to live in fear. Katniss describes him as good-looking, lean, and hard-muscled, capable of landing any girl in the district that he wants. But instead of the childhood best friend, the boy who looms large over the story is instead Peeta, the other tribute from District 12. Peeta and Katniss had a brief interaction years ago when he was kind to her, when he gave her bread because she was starving, and this actually complicates things for Katniss. As she says, "To this day, I can never shake the connection between this boy, Peeta Mellark, and the bread that gave me hope, and the dandelion that reminded me I was not doomed. And more than once, I have turned in the school hallway and caught his eyes trained on me, only to quickly flit away. I feel like I owe him something, and I hate owing people. Maybe if I had thanked him at some point, I'd be feeling less conflicted now." I thought about it a couple of times, but the opportunity never seemed to present itself. And now it never will, because we're going to be thrown into an arena to fight to the death. Exactly how am I supposed to work in a thank you in there? Somehow, it just won't seem sincere if I'm trying to slit his throat. Peeta has had a crush on Katniss for years, which he announces on stage, on TV, to the entire country during his interview. He really does like Katniss, but he is also obviously using this as strategy. And that's how their relationship evolves over the course of the games. Peeta starts out by teaming up with the careers to hunt Katniss down, which is an obvious betrayal, but then it turns out that he's only trying to protect Katniss. Later in the games, Katniss finds Peeta mortally injured and cares for him, instigating kissing, cuddling, and other romantic gestures, but it's a ploy to get sponsors on their side so that they can save Peeta's life. Katniss clearly learns to care for him, even risking her life for him at multiple points, but she's also unsure about how he really feels about her or how she really feels about him. Here's an excerpt. "For a moment, I'm almost foolishly happy, and then confusion sweeps over me, because we're supposed to be making up this stuff, playing at being in love, not actually being in love. But Peeta's story has a ring of truth to it. That part about my father and the birds. And I did sing the first day of school, although I don't remember the song. And that red plaid dress. There was one, a hand-me-down to Prim that got washed to rags after my father's death. It would explain another thing, too. Why Peeta took a beating to give me the bread on that awful hollow day. So, if those details are true, could it all be true?" The most telling sign of Katniss's feelings for Peeta is when she chooses potential suicide over having to kill Peeta to win the games. When faced with the possibility of having no winner at all, the Capitol decides that they're fine with two winners, actually, But, of course, once the games are over, they have to return to the real world, where they face the wrath of the capital. And Katniss only averts disaster by convincing the country of Panem in a TV interview that she was just so in love with Peeta that she couldn't help it. As Katniss says, I don't know, I just couldn't bear the thought of being without him. But then, on the train home to District 12, Katniss accidentally mentions that she was coached for that final interview, and Peeta is both shocked and hurt. It was all for the games, Peeta says. How you acted. Not all of it, I say, tightly holding onto my flowers. Then how much? No, forget that. I guess the real question is, what's going to be left when we get home, he says. I don't know. The closer we get to District 12, the more confused I get, I say. He waits for further explanation, but none's forthcoming. Well, let me know when you work it out, he says, and the pain in his voice is palpable. I know my ears are healed because even with the rumble of the engine, I can hear every step he takes back to the train. By the time I've climbed aboard, Peeta has disappeared into his room for the night. I don't see him the next morning either. In fact, the next time he turns up, we're pulling into District 12. He gives me a nod, his face expressionless. I want to tell him he's not being fair, that we were strangers, that I did what it took to stay alive, to keep us both alive in the arena, that I can't explain how things are with Gale because I don't know myself, that it's no good loving me because I'm never going to get married anyway, and he'd just end up hating me later instead of sooner, that if I do have feelings for him, it doesn't matter because I'll never be able to afford the kind of love that leads to a family, to children. And how can he? How can he after what we've just been through? I also want to tell him how much I already miss him, but that wouldn't be fair on my part. So we just stand there silently, watching our grimy little station rise up around us. Through the window, I can see the platforms thick with cameras. Everyone will be eagerly watching our homecoming. Out of the corner of my eye, I see Peeta extend his hand. I look at him, unsure. One more time, for the audience, he says. His voice isn't angry, it's hollow, which is worse. Already, the boy with the bread is slipping away from me. I take his hand, holding on tightly, preparing for the cameras, and dreading the moment I will finally have to let go. And that is the end of The Hunger Games, Book 1. The final reason number 6, is themes, i.e., what it all means. The first and most prevalent theme throughout the book is, of course, the social commentary about the way that entertainment and news are often packaged in similar ways and even accessed on the same platforms, leading to mass desensitization, the inability to distinguish between the two. In a 2018 10-year anniversary Scholastic interview with Suzanne Collins, the interviewer says, "Let's start at the origin moment for The Hunger Games. You were flipping through channels one night." And Suzanne Collins replies, "Yes, I was flipping through the channels one night between reality television programs and actual footage of the Iraq War when the idea came to me." In a 2008 interview with the School Library Journal, she went into a little more depth on this response. "When I was a kid, my dad fought in Vietnam. He was gone for a year, even though my mom tried to protect us. I'm the youngest of 4. Sometimes the TV would be on, and I would see the footage from the war zone. I was little, but I would hear them say Vietnam, and I knew my dad was there, and it was very frightening. I'm sure that a lot of people today experience that same thing. But there is so much programming, and I worry that we're all getting a little desensitized to the images on our televisions. If you're watching a sitcom, that's fine, but if there's a real-life tragedy unfolding, you should not be thinking of yourself as an audience member, because those are real people on the screen, and they're not going away when the commercials start to roll. TVs are so prominent throughout the book because everything is televised. Everything is a spectacle, and everyone in the capital is consuming these brutal Hunger Games as entertainment. But there's another theme that Suzanne Collins brings up in that 2018 interview, just war theory. She describes it as an attempt to define what circumstances give you the moral right to wage war and what is acceptable behavior within that war and its aftermath. But let's take a closer look at this idea using the Wikipedia article. Just war theory, as it's most commonly understood today, has two separate sets of criteria. The first set of criteria is about the right to go to war, which is broken down into competent authority, probability of success, last resort, and just cause. And then the second set of criteria governs conduct during the war. Again, this is broken down into distinction, proportionality, military necessity, fair treatment of prisoners of war, and no evil means. There is a third set of criteria that governs conduct after war, but the Hunger Games books aren't really concerned with the aftermath of war, so let's stick with the first two, the right to go to war and conduct during war. Clearly, in the first book, we are moving towards rebellion. Katniss is the girl who was on fire, and Panem is about to become the country on fire. And it's interesting to see how this first set of criteria apply to the situation we see in the Hunger Games. So our criteria are competent authority, probability of success, last resort, and just cause. Criterion number 1, competent authority. Competent authority, according to Wikipedia, means that only duly constituted public authorities may wage war, because a just war requires a political system that allows distinctions of justice. Now, in the case of Panem, at the end of Book 1, the districts are becoming more and more dissatisfied with the capital's brutality and cruelty, but the only real option at this point is just people fighting against the peacekeepers, basically. And that's not really a situation that you can describe as a political system allowing for distinctions of justice. That's just a situation best described as a mess, with not much room for justice all around. Criterion number 2, probability of success. Probability of success refers, of course, to how good your chances are of winning. Because if you don't think you have an actual shot at winning, then it's not really justified to uproot and destroy the lives of countless people. And really, in the situation at the end of Book 1, there probably isn't much chance of success. If by success you mean actually overthrowing the capital and not just inconveniencing them. So far we are at 0 out of 4 on the right to go to war. Criterion number 3, last resort. Last resort, according to Wikipedia, means that all non-violent options must first be exhausted before the use of force can be justified. This is the first one that I think is very clearly in favor of revolt. There really isn't a way around violence in a highly militaristic country where you don't even have free speech. How else, other than full-scale revolt, are you going to enact real change? Criterion number 4, just cause. Just cause simply says that your purposes for instigating war can't simply be selfish. It can't be, for example, a profit motive. But here, as Suzanne Collins herself says, the citizens of the districts have no basic human rights, are treated as slave labor, and are subjected to the Hunger Games annually. I believe the majority of today's audience would define that as grounds for revolution. So we have last resort and we have just cause, but that still leaves us at 2 out of 4 on the right to go to war. But of course, we do know that we are going to war in the sequels, so let's talk about them. Right off the bat, the sequel, Catching Fire, sets the darker tone that the rest of the trilogy will stick to. Here's an excerpt from the opening pages of the book. If it were up to me, I would try to forget the Hunger Games entirely, never speak of them, pretend they were nothing but a bad dream. But the Victory Tour makes that impossible. Strategically placed almost midway between the annual games, it is the capital's way of keeping the horror fresh and immediate. Not only are we in the districts forced to remember the iron grip of the capital's power each year, we are forced to celebrate it. And this year, I am one of the stars of the show. I will have to travel from district to district to stand before the cheering crowds who secretly loathe me, to look down into the faces of the families whose children I have killed. Katniss's mindset in this book is dark, to say the least. She is dealing with self-hatred and self-doubt, terrible memories, and the general emotional aftermath of the Hunger Games. She won, sure, but she also lost her self-conception, the person she understood herself to be. Before the games, Katniss's self-identity, the way she saw herself, was as the person who took care of her family. But after the games, she's killed people to ensure her own survival. Her relationships with both Gale and Peeta are complicated, and her family is financially fine. They don't need her to support them. As Suzanne Collins said in a 2013 interview with Time, she's got a lot of classic post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. She has nightmares, she has flashbacks, and in the beginning, you can see she's practicing avoidance. She's completely pushed Peeta to arm's length, you know? She's trying to stay away from him. Why? Because everything associated with him, except some very early childhood memories, are associated with the games. She's conflicted to some degree about her relationship with Prem because she couldn't save Rue. So she's dealing with all of that, and her method of dealing with it is to go to the woods and be alone and keep all of that as far away as possible because there are just so many triggers in her everyday life. But of course, what happens right as the story is beginning is the Victory Tour, and that means that she is going to have to go to every district and stand there and look at the families of the dead children. Some of them in some districts, like District 1, she killed both tributes. She killed both Marvel and Glimmer, so it's this nightmare waiting to happen. But I think the real nightmare is the inside of Katniss's head. Here's an excerpt. I rest my head forward on the edge of the table, overcome with loathing for myself, wishing I had died in the arena, wishing Seneca Crane had blown me to bits, the way President Snow said he should have when I held out the berries. The berries! I realized the answer to who I am lies in that handful of poisonous fruit. If I held them out to save Peeta because I knew I would be shunned if I came back without him, then I am despicable. If I held them out because I loved him, I am still self-centered, although forgivable. But if I held them out to defy the capital, I am someone of worth. The trouble is, I don't know exactly what was going on inside me at that moment? Could it be the people in the districts are right? That it was an act of rebellion, even if it was an unconscious one? Because deep down, I must know it isn't enough to keep myself or my family or my friends alive by running away. Even if I could, it wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't stop people from being hurt the way Gale was today. Life in District 12 isn't really so different from life in the arena. At some point, you have to stop running and turn around and face whoever wants you dead. Katniss is stuck emotionally at the beginning of the book, and it's probably not a coincidence that the story also feels like it has trouble finding its momentum. Sequels in general are difficult to pull off well, and writing the middle book in a trilogy is notoriously tricky. If you look at the story structure of the Hunger Games trilogy, the first book kicks things off with the excitement of, well, the Hunger Games, and the third book, Mockingjay, chronicles the rebellion. So the question is, what is interesting enough to keep people's attention while also not taking the story too far? Most of Catching Fire centers on Katniss's emotional state, but in the background, we can also sense the rumblings of rebellion and the capital's resulting agitation. Katniss has become a symbol of rebellion, and thus, from the capital's point of view, the first step in squelching the rebellion is to get rid of Katniss. And that is how we get a plotline arguably more audacious than even the first book. Katniss has PTSD from the Hunger Games? Let's toss her in the arena again. That's right, in this book, the villainous President Snow calls for a quarter-quell, and I will let the book explain what this is. The anthem plays, and my throat tightens with revulsion as President Snow takes the stage. He's followed by a young boy dressed in a white suit, holding a simple wooden box. The anthem ends, and President Snow begins to speak, to remind us all of the dark days from which the Hunger Games were born. When the laws for the games were laid out, they dictated that every 25 years, the anniversary would be marked by a quarter-quell. It would call for a glorified version of the games to make fresh the memory of those killed by the district's rebellion. These words could not be more pointed, since I suspect several districts are rebelling right now. President Snow goes on to tell what happened in the previous quarter-quells. On the 25th anniversary, as a reminder to the rebels that their children were dying because of their choice to initiate violence, every district was made to hold an election and vote on the tributes who would represent it. I wonder how that would have felt, picking the kids who had to go. It is worse, I think, to be turned over by your own neighbors than have your name drawn from the reaping ball. On the 50th anniversary, the president continues, as a reminder that 2 rebels died for each capital citizen, every district was required to send twice as many tributes. I imagine facing a field of 47 instead of 23. Worse odds, less hope, and ultimately more dead kids. That was the year Haymitch won. I had a friend who went that year, says my mother quietly. Maisley Donner. Her parents owned the sweet shop. They gave me her songbird after, a canary. Prim and I exchange a look. It's the first we've ever heard of Maisley Donner. Maybe because my mother knew we would want to know how she died. And now we honor our third quarter-quell, says the president. The little boy in white steps forward, holding out the box as he opens the lid. We can see the tidy, upright rows of yellowed envelopes. Whoever devised the quarter-quell system had prepared for centuries of Hunger Games. The president removes an envelope, clearly marked with a 75. He runs his finger under the flap and pulls out a small square of paper. Without hesitation, he reads, "On the 75th anniversary, as a reminder to the rebels that even the strongest amongst them cannot overcome the power of the capital, the male and female tributes will be reaped from their existing pool of victors." My mother gives a faint shriek and Prim buries her face in her hands, but I feel more like the people I see in the crowd on television. Slightly baffled. What does it mean? Existing pool of victors. Then I get it, what it means. At least for me. District 12 only has 3 existing victors to choose from. 2 male, 1 female. I am going back to the arena. What an interesting storytelling choice, and it's even more interesting when you look at the pacing. In my hardback edition of Catching Fire, President Snow doesn't make this announcement until page 171, and the actual games don't start until page 267. Book 1 also didn't get to the games right away, but in Catching Fire, it's even more condensed because the games aren't announced until the second half of the book, and the games themselves only take up around 100 pages. Obviously, this is deliberate because we have been through the games before and we know how it works. But also, the games are not the point because the games are the Capitol's annual assertion of dominance, of saying, you guys have to do what we say or else. And with the slow rise of rebellion, the point of including the games in Catching Fire is to show that the Capitol is increasingly losing control, that it is no longer dominant. Katniss won her first round in the arena via an act of defiance, but in Catching Fire, District 13 steps in to make sure that this time she's not even going to be playing the game. In the history of Panem, there is only one district to successfully rebel against the Capitol, and that is District 13. Because their specialty was nuclear power, District 13's stalemate with the Capitol ended in the realization that continuing to fight would be a losing situation for everyone, and that is how District 13 survived. The trade-off, of course, is that the Capitol insists that District 13 was destroyed, and since District 13 has gone underground, it's not like anyone's going to contradict them. But with rebellions breaking out across Panem in the aftermath of Katniss's Hunger Games victory, District 13 has decided that now is the time to act, and as part of their strategy, they essentially kidnap Katniss from the Hunger Games arena. Katniss's reaction to this is, let's say, complicated. There was a plan to break us out of the arena from the moment the quell was announced. The victor tributes from 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, and 11 had varying degrees of knowledge about it. Plutarch Heavensby has been, for several years, part of an undercover group aiming to overthrow the Capitol. He made sure the wire was among the weapons. BT was in charge of blowing a hole in the force field. The bread we received in the arena was code for the time of the rescue. The district where the bread originated indicated the day. 3. The number of rolls, the hour. 24. The hovercraft belongs to District 13. Bonnie and Twill, the women I met in the woods from 8, were right about its existence and its defense capabilities. We are currently on a very roundabout journey to District 13. Meanwhile, most of the districts in Panem are in full-scale rebellion. Haymitch stops to see if I am following, or maybe he is done for the moment. It's an awful lot to take in, this elaborate plan in which I was a piece, just as I was meant to be a piece in the Hunger Games. Used without consent, without knowledge. At least in the Hunger Games, I knew I was being played with. My supposed friends have been a lot more secretive. This feeling of being used, of being part of someone else's strategy, follows Katniss throughout the final book in the trilogy, Mockingjay. In Mockingjay, the rebellion is finally underway, but Katniss is mostly stuck at District 13, tucked away safely underground, pulled out only for propaganda purposes. As much as it's a war of guns and bombs, it's also a war of TV messaging, of convincing people that your side is the righteous, justified one. And it's incredibly powerful for District 13 that they now have Katniss, the girl who was on fire, the girl who helped, however unintentionally, ignite the rebellion. But like the iconic Mockingjay pin that Katniss wore throughout her time at the games, she's more or less a symbol rather than someone who is actively thinking up strategy or fighting battles. Katniss spends a lot of the book hiding, dissociating, trying to process everything that has happened up to this point. District 12, her home, has been destroyed. Peeta was taken hostage by the Capitol, and Katniss still carries the emotional and physical scars of participating twice in the Hunger Games. But also, she's not entirely sure that District 13's the answer she's been looking for. Life in District 13 is, let's say, not fun. Everyone in District 13 is given a daily schedule that is stamped on their arm. Said schedule has to be followed rigorously, except of course when it comes to Katniss, because the rebels need her more than they need her obedience. But that's not to say that she can just do whatever she wants. At the dining hall, I flash my schedule, which includes some kind of ID number, in front of a sensor. As I slide my tray along the metal shelf before the vats of food, I see breakfast is its usual dependable self. A bowl of hot grain, a cup of milk, and a small scoop of fruit or vegetables. Today, mashed turnips. All of it comes from 13's underground farms. I sit at a table assigned to the Everdeens and Hawthorns and some other refugees, and shovel my food down, wishing for seconds. But there are never seconds here. They have nutrition down to a science. You leave with enough calories to take you to the next meal, no more, no less. Serving size is based on your age, height, body type, health, and amount of physical labor required by your schedule. The people from 12 are already getting slightly larger portions than the natives of 13 in an effort to bring us up to weight. I guess bony soldiers tire too quickly. It's working though. In just a month, we're starting to look healthier, particularly the kids. Gale sets his tray beside me, and I try not to stare at his turnips too pathetically because I really want more, and he's already too quick to slip me his food. Even though I turn my attention to neatly folding my napkin, a spoonful of turnips slops into my bowl. "You've got to stop that," I say. But since I'm already scooping up the stuff, it's not too convincing. Really, it's probably illegal or something. They have very strict rules about food. For instance, if you don't finish something and want to save it for later, you can't take it from the dining hall. Apparently, in the early days, there was some incident of food hoarding. For a couple of people like Gale and me, who've been in charge of our family's food supply for years, it doesn't sit well. We know how to be hungry, but not how to be told how to handle what provisions we have. In some ways, District 13 is even more controlling than the Capitol. Katniss's relationship with District 13 remains fraught throughout the book because she doesn't necessarily like or trust them, but she doesn't really have a choice when it comes to supporting them because how else is the Capitol going to be defeated? I mentioned before that Katniss isn't a self-insert character, and I'm going to expand on that here by saying that she's also not really a hero character. She's always a catalyst for change, but at the end of the day, she is still a 16, 17-year-old kid. She's not going to be single-handedly saving Panem or the world. And I think that's why we care so much about what happens to her. She's smart and brave and strong, but she needs District 13 to instigate lasting change in Panem, just as much as they need her to be their symbolic leader, their Mockingjay. A lot of this book, Mockingjay, navigates the complexities of wartime ethics as Katniss continues to try to protect the interests of the people closest to her as she's done throughout the series. For example, Peeta spends much of the book as the Capitol's hostage, and via both threat of torture and actual torture, Peeta cooperates with the Capitol to create anti-District 13 propaganda. Katniss is racked with guilt over what's happened to him, and not only is she determined to rescue him, but she's also determined to ensure that once she does, District 13 won't harm him. Here's the conversation that Katniss has with Prim. It's just, Peeta, I'm afraid if we do win, the rebels will execute him as a traitor. Prim thinks this over. Katniss, I don't think you understand how important you are in the cause. Important people usually get what they want. If you want to keep Peeta safe from the rebels, you can. I guess I'm important. They went to a lot of trouble to rescue me. They took me to 12. You mean I could demand that they give Peeta immunity and they'd have to agree to it? I think you could demand almost anything and they'd have to agree to it. Prim wrinkles her brow. Only how do you know they'll keep their word? I remember all of the lies Haymitch told Peeta and me to get us to do what he wanted. What's to keep the rebels from reneging on the deal? A verbal promise behind closed doors, even a statement written on paper. These could easily evaporate after the war, their existence or validity denied. Any witnesses in command will be worthless. In fact, they'd probably be the ones writing out Peeta's death warrant. I'll need a much larger pool of witnesses. I'll need everyone I can get. It will have to be public, I say. Buttercup gives a flick of his tail that I take as agreement. I'll make Coin announce it in front of the entire population of 13. On the one hand, this feels kind of extreme, right? I mean, surely District 13's government can understand that if you imprison and torture someone, they don't have much of a choice except to cooperate. But as we've already discussed, District 13 can be more similar to the Capitol in its approach to government than Katniss is comfortable with. And I think one of the biggest examples of this is what happens to Katniss's prep team. So in book 1, there was a big emphasis on making over the tributes in an effort to ensure that the kids were as photogenic as possible. That was where Katniss first met her prep team, and they've been with her throughout the trilogy. The head of the prep team is Cinna, the guy who designed all of her eye-catching costumes and who's clearly on Katniss's side pretty much from day one. But the other 3 people on the prep team are mostly there to do what Cinna says. Katniss doesn't like them per se, but she is used to them. And it's these 3 who are kidnapped from the Capitol and taken to District 13, where Katniss finds them in a dungeon. Or maybe not a literal dungeon, but you'll get what I mean. Here's the excerpt. The preps have been forced into cramped body positions for so long that even once the shackles have been removed, they have trouble walking. Gale, Plutarch, and I have to help them. Flavius's foot catches on a metal grate over a circular opening in the floor, and my stomach contracts when I think of why a room would need a drain. The stains of human misery that must have been hosed off these white tile floors. In the hospital, I find my mother, the only one I trust to care for them. It takes her a minute to place the 3, given their current condition, but already she wears a look of consternation. And I know it's not a result of seeing abused bodies, because they were her daily fare in District 12, but the realization that this sort of thing goes on in District 13 as well. Katniss is upset over this situation, but Gale is kind of confused. By this point in the story, Gale's found his place in the world. He's always wanted to fight the Capitol, he's always wanted to rebel, and becoming a soldier and eventual military strategist for District 13 is kind of his dream, the thing he's been looking for his entire life. And so he and Katniss are developing this rift where he doesn't understand the more nuanced view that Katniss takes on the war and District 13. And that rift is first clearly articulated in this argument that they have over what District 13 has done to Katniss's prep team. Katniss, why do you care so much about your prep team? I open my eyes to see if he's joking, but he's frowning down at the rabbit he's skinning. Why shouldn't I? Let's see. Because they spent the last year putting you up for slaughter, he suggests. It's more complicated than that. I know them. They're not evil or cruel. They're not even that smart. Hurting them, it's like hurting children. They don't see, they don't know. I get knotted up in my words. They don't know what, Katniss, he says. That tributes? Who are the actual children involved here, not your trio of freaks, are forced to fight to the death? That you were going into that arena for people's amusement? Was that a big secret at the Capitol? No, but they don't view it the way we do, I say. They're raised on it, and... Are you actually defending them? He slips the skin from the rabbit in one quick move. That stings, because, in fact, I am, and it's ridiculous. I struggle to find a logical position. I guess I'm defending anyone who's treated like that for taking a slice of bread. Maybe it reminds me too much of what happened to you over a turkey. Still, he's right. It does seem strange, my level of concern over the prep team. I should hate them and want to see them strung up. But they're so clueless, and they belong to Cinna. And he was on my side, right? I'm not looking for a fight, Gale says. But I don't think Coin was sending you some big message by punishing them for breaking the rules here. She probably thought you'd see it as a favor. He stuffs the rabbit in the sack and rises. We better get going if we want to make it back on time. I ignore his offer of a hand up and get to my feet unsteadily. Fine. Neither of us talks on the way back, but once we're inside the gate, I think of something else. During the quarter quell, Octavia and Flavius had to quit because they couldn't stop crying over me going back in. And Venia could barely say goodbye. I'll try and keep that in mind as they remake you, says Gale. Do, I say. Katniss feels empathy for her prep team, but in her words, she struggles to find a logical position from which to express her empathy. Now, I don't know about logic, but I can easily provide an ethical objection to District 13's actions by going back to one of the themes that Suzanne Collins pointed to as central to the trilogy, and that is, of course, just war theory. As you'll remember, according to Wikipedia, just war theory is primarily split into the right to go to war and also right conduct within war. When we last discussed just war theory, we discussed how in Book 1, the rebellion hadn't quite reached the point where it fulfilled the criteria for the right to go to war, but those criteria were fulfilled once District 13 entered the picture. So now let's turn to that second idea, right conduct within war. The criteria here are distinction, proportionality, military necessity, fair treatment of prisoners of war, and no evil means. Let's zoom in on fair treatment of prisoners of war. However you feel about Katniss' prep team, however culpable or complicit they are or aren't, they are prisoners of war. They're not in District 13 of their own volition, and as such, they must be treated fairly. You can't say the Capitol is bad for torturing PETA, then turn around and say that the prep team deserved what they got. They can be tried for their wrongdoings after the war via due process, but they can't be tortured during wartime, or you can no longer argue that you're the good guys trying to bring justice. Things get even more complicated when you look at how other events in the story do, or rather don't, fit the other criteria on this list. For example, let's look at District 13's battle to capture District 2, and more specifically, the strategy that Gale comes up with to deal with the Nut. And what is the Nut, you may ask? Here's the excerpt. At the center of the district is a virtually impenetrable mountain that houses the heart of the capital's military. We've nicknamed the mountain the Nut since I relayed Plutarch's tough nut to crack comment to the weary and discouraged rebel leaders here. The Nut was established directly after the Dark Days, when the capital had lost 13 and was desperate for a new underground stronghold. They had lost some of their military resources situated on the outskirts of the capital itself: nuclear missiles, aircraft, troops. But a significant chunk of their power was now under an enemy's control. Of course, there was no way they could hope to replicate 13, which was the work of centuries. However, in the old mines of nearby District 2, they saw opportunity. From the air, the nut appeared to be just another mountain with a few entrances on its faces. But inside were vast, cavernous spaces where slabs of stones had been cut, hauled up to the surface, and transported down slippery, narrow roads to make distant buildings. There was even a train system to facilitate transporting the miners from the nut to the very center of the main town in District 2. It ran right to the square that Peeta and I visited during the victory tour, standing on the wide marble steps of the Justice Building, trying not to look too closely at Catos and Cloves, grieving families assembled below us. It was not the most ideal terrain, plagued as it was by mudslides, floods, and avalanches, but the advantages outweighed the concerns. As they cut deep into the mountain, the miners had left large pillars and walls of stone to support the infrastructure. The capital reinforced these and set about making the mountain their new military base, filling it with computer banks and meeting rooms, barracks and arsenals, widening entrances to allow the exit of hovercraft from the hangar, installing missile launchers, but on the whole, leaving the exterior of the mountain largely unchanged. A rough, rocky tangle of trees and wildlife, a natural fortress to protect them from their enemies. Gale's strategy to deal with the nut is to destroy it, to obliterate everything and everyone inside. Katniss isn't exactly thrilled with this approach, and an argument ensues. The implications of what Gale is suggesting settle quietly around the room. You can see the reaction playing out on people's faces. The expressions range from pleasure to distress, from sorrow to satisfaction. The majority of the workers are citizens from 2, says BT neutrally. So what, says Gale. We'll never be able to trust them again. They should at least get a chance to surrender, says Lime. Well, that's a luxury we weren't given when they firebombed 12, but you're all so much cozier with the capital here, says Gale. By the look on Lime's face, I think she might shoot him, or at least take a swing. She probably had the upper hand too with all her training, but her anger only seems to infuriate him and he yells, "We watched children burn to death, and there was nothing we could do." I have to close my eyes a minute as the image rips through me. It has the desired effect. I want everyone in the mountain dead. I'm about to say so, but then I'm also a girl from District 12, not President Snow. I can't help it. I can't condemn someone to the death he's suggesting. Gale, I say, taking his arm and trying to speak in a reasonable tone. The nut's an old mine. It'd be like causing a massive coal mining accident. Surely the words are enough to make anyone from 12 think twice about the plan. But not so quick as the one that killed our fathers, he retorts. Is that everyone's problem? That our enemies might have a few hours to reflect on the fact that they're dying instead of just being blown to bits? Back in the old days, when we were nothing more than a couple of kids hunting outside of 12, Gale said things like this and worse. But then they were just words. Here, put into practice, they become deeds that can never be reversed. You don't know how those District 2 people ended up in the nut, I say. They may have been coerced. They may be held against their will. Some are our own spies. Will you kill them too? I would sacrifice a few, yes, to take out the rest of them, he replies. And if I were a spy in there, I'd say, bring on the avalanches. I know he's telling the truth. That Gale would sacrifice his life in this way for the cause. No one doubts it. Perhaps we'd all do the same if we were the spies and given the choice. I guess I would. But it's a cold-hearted decision to make for other people and those who love them. Gale's suggestion wins, and as you might expect, the results are, well, horrific. Gale's plan exceeds anyone's expectations. BT was right about being unable to control the avalanches once they've been set in motion. The mountainsides are naturally unstable, but weakened by the explosions. They seem almost fluid. Whole sections of the nut collapse before our eyes, obliterating any sign that human beings have ever set foot on the place. We stand speechless, tiny and insignificant, as waves of stone thunder down the mountain, burying the entrances under tons of rock, raising a cloud of dirt and debris that blackens the sky, turning the nut into a tomb. I imagine the hell inside the mountain, sirens wailing, lights flickering into darkness, stone dust choking the air, the shrieks of panicked, trapped beings stumbling madly for a way out, only to find the entrances, the launch pad, the ventilation shafts themselves clogged with earth and rock, trying to force its way in, live wires flung free, fires breaking out, rubble making a familiar path a maze. People slamming, shoving, scrambling like ants as the hill presses in, threatening to crush their fragile shells. From Gale's point of view, he's applying the principle of military necessity. As Wikipedia says, the harm caused to civilians or civilian property must be proportional and not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And Gale truly believes that his strategy for the nut fits this criteria. Katniss, on the other hand, is saying that this attack is in violation of the criteria of distinction and also probably of proportionality. Distinction means that you shouldn't attack civilians, and proportionality means that the harm caused to civilians or civilian property is not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated by an attack on a legitimate military objective. Katniss's argument is that first, a lot of the people in the nut may be soldiers in name, but they didn't choose to be there, just as she never got to choose whether or not she wanted to be in the Hunger Games. And second, partially because of her trauma surrounding her father's death in the coal mines, Katniss feels like this is a particularly disproportionate death for people who probably don't deserve to die. All of this isn't necessarily to say that District 13 is bad or Gale is bad, but more so to say war is complicated and messy and ugly. No matter how just your cause is for going to war, again, the first part of the just war theory, and I do think the Hunger Games are just cause enough for anyone, no matter how just the cause, your execution of the war, your conduct during the war, isn't going to be perfectly aligned with the principles laid out in the second part of just war theory, because there really doesn't exist such a thing as an ethically unambiguous war. You can't actually follow all of these principles all of the time, and sometimes you end up with horrific consequences, like the death of Prim, Katniss's beloved sister. Prim is 14 years old, not even a soldier, she's a medic in training, and during the climactic invasion of the capital, bombs are dropped on a group of helpless children. Prim goes in with her fellow medics to assist the kids, but that's when the rest of the bombs go off. The problem, of course, is that the bombs that killed Prim were created by Gale. This is kind of the end of Gale and Katniss's friendship, and obviously any chance of a relationship, but also, even though Katniss doesn't know and will never know for sure if it was the rebels who dropped those bombs, this is an act that is just so atrocious to her personally that she can't accept it, and rightfully so. But that's war, right? Even a war fought against the evil, despotic, authoritarian President Snow and his regime is going to have moments where it's no longer a question of who's right or wrong, whether or not you're fighting a just war. It just becomes pain that you have to deal with for the rest of your life. But if the ending of Mockingjay tells us anything, it's that even in the midst of that pain, you can still find happiness. You can still find joy. And sometimes you can even find hope. It's never going to be okay, but from time to time, it's going to be worthwhile enough to keep going. But that's not quite the end of the story or of the video, because in 2021, Suzanne Collins released a Hunger Games prequel, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, chronicling the early life of Coriolanus Snow, eventual president of Panem and Katniss's arch-nemesis. In this book, Snow is attending the Academy, which is essentially the fancy high school in the capital, and he's competing for a scholarship to attend university. The failed rebellion ended not that long ago, and most people are still struggling, including the Snow family. The Snows have fallen on difficult times, and so Coriolanus is very much determined to go to college and make something of himself. In order to go to college, however, he needs that scholarship, and to get that scholarship, he has to act as mentor to one of the tributes for that year's Hunger Games. His tribute is a girl from District 12, sound familiar? And her name is Lucy Gray Baird. Instead of being good with a bow and an arrow, she's good at music, and Coriolanus knows that she has no chance whatsoever of winning, but he still finds himself inexplicably drawn to her. So that's the basic premise of the book, and I feel like I should acknowledge at this point that villain origin stories are hard to write. We already know how his story ends. We already think of him as a terrible person, and so you have to ask, well, why do I want to read this other than that it's a new Hunger Games book? Let me give you a couple of reasons you should consider reading this book, and then we will get to my last positive thoughts. Reason number one to read it. The world building and perspective are really interesting. This book is essentially set in the rubble of the capital, a capital that is still trying to rebuild. And so we're not seeing the capital as the glittering paradise that Katniss found, but instead a much more raw, desperate place where a lot of things are in flux, including the social hierarchy. A lot of old, moneyed families like the Snows have fallen on hard times, but a lot of newly rich families from the districts are coming in to take their place. And so you see how Snow becomes this reactionary force, this bulwark against change, because of these very vivid experiences where he fears losing his place in society. Also, getting to see Panem from the perspective of people living in the capital is incredibly interesting when we've only ever gotten the perspective of people living in the districts. Reason number two to read this book is Lucy Gray, the girl tribute from District 12. She's charismatic, she's dynamic, she's born to showmanship, and like Katniss, she is also deeply caring and empathetic. I really enjoyed her character, but this is a bit of a qualified compliment, which I'll be getting to in a bit. First though, I need to talk about the pacing because this book is a bit longer than the original books. My hardcover edition runs to almost 500 pages, but it's not substantially longer, and yet it felt so much longer when I was reading it. I flew through the original trilogy, but this book took me weeks to get through, and it was purely due to my reaction to the main character. The plot is exciting, there's plenty of stuff going on, the action is well paced, but the problem is just that I wasn't all that interested in Snow because I didn't find him to be a fun or interesting character to read about. It's not that I don't like villain characters, but I tend to like villain characters better when they're having at least some level of fun with their villainy. In this book, though, Snow is just such a lukewarm villain. He kinda wants to be good, except when it gets in his way. And he kinda wants to be bad, except again when it runs counter to his interests. A large chunk of this book is dedicated to his moral evolution, or devolution, which would have been fine if I cared, but I didn't, because there was never a moment where I believed that Snow truly cared about anything other than himself and his interests. There really isn't a central moral dilemma. He more so goes through a series of moral waverings over and over and over again, and at some point, I just stopped caring. My other major issue with the book is the way it utilized the character of Lucy Gray. Like I said, I loved her character, but I hated that she was reduced to being a plot device in Snow's story. I foresaw the ending the entire time, and the entire time I was like, please don't do that, and the book did it anyway. But it's an ending that I've read so many times before, and quite honestly, it's not an ending I've ever liked or enjoyed, because you have these interesting, charismatic, fascinating female characters, and then it turns out their only purpose is furthering the male protagonist's character arc. Having said all of that, I am still excited for the movie because I think that The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes is a very cinematic story, and since the movie isn't going to be in Snow's perspective, like we aren't going to be in his head, I'm thinking that he'll probably be a more enjoyable protagonist on screen. And that is the iconic Hunger Games trilogy and also the prequel. I hope this video essay helped you get hyped for the release of the new movie, and I also hope that this video helped you revisit your nostalgia for the original books. This has been the 2 a.m. Book Review Club. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll be back soon with another video. Until then, have a great day, and happy book travels.